Hello, everybody. It's really lovely to see you tonight. We're going to be talking about a lot of subjects. We're mostly going to be thinking about the Panopticon effect and the understanding and impact that has on the way that we work with women, particularly who are experiencing domestic violence and coercive control. So I'm just putting that out there at the start now. So if that's a subject that's difficult for you, be aware that you can step aside or you can come back and look later on, whatever feels best for you. But obviously, we'd really love for you to join in and be able to sort of share your ideas and thoughts and ask questions. So before I get started and introduce our fantastic guest, let me hand you over to Dave, who will show you how you can join in on social media.
Hi everyone, thanks Nicky. So as always, there's two options to join in as we're live. The first one is on the Facebook Live feed. So all you need to do is wander to the side of the video and there's a place there where you can type in any comments, questions, thoughts. The other option that you've got is heading over to Twitter whilst you're watching, and as long as you include the hashtag MHTV, we'll be able to see what you're saying about tonight's episode. Without further ado, straight back to you, Nicky.
Okay, and please, I'm very pleased indeed to be able to introduce you to Tirion. So Tirion, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hello, and thank you very much, Nicky, for inviting me today. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much. So I'm Tirion Havard. I'm an associate professor in the social work department at London South Bank University.
And tell us a little bit about the kind of subject that we're going to be talking about today, particularly around coercive control. How did you get interested in and involved in working in this? It's such an interesting but such a difficult sphere. What led you to it?
So I think, so I'm going back a few years now, and I think it probably all started, I got my social work qualification, became a qualified and registered social worker, and went to work in the probation service. And sort of developed a real fascination. You have to go on this, standard induction training, and the domestic violence one was the one that really caught my eye and caught my interest. And I soon learned that when you learn to ask the right questions, actually there's quite a lot of perpetrators of domestic abuse that come through probation doors. And so I guess I just sort of, I wouldn't say I specialised in it, but almost all of my caseload were perpetrators of domestic abuse, whether that was their index offence or not. And I did that and I was, worked in the probation service for many years, and sort of always tried to keep up with sort of thinking around domestic abuse. And then I had my babe, my son, and decided I wanted to step back from the front line, really. And got a job at London South Bank University, and with academia there's kind of an expectation that you do a PhD, and so it sort of made sense really to do it about domestic abuse because that had been an interest of mine for so many years. And round about the time when I was really having to make a decision, yes or no, there was the uprising in Egypt. And I don't know if you remember it, but one of the things that happened was that the president shut down all the mobile phone networks, so that they couldn't communicate, and that and it was a way to manage the rioting. And I kind of put two and two together and thought, oh, domestic abuse, mobile phones, there must be something. There must be something there, and sort of use that really as the topic for my PhD. And sort of since then have just been more and more fascinated because it's because it's technology, it moves really quickly, and so there's always something to learn, and there's always something to find out. So and I just find it really fascinating.
Take it back a little bit, if you don't mind.
No.
Why did you want to? Because being a social worker isn't always an obvious choice, and then on top of that, going into probation is even less an obvious choice. So, what was the things that actually drew you in that direction? Because that's unusual, isn't it? It's not everyone's cup of tea.
Yeah, well, I think I always wanted to be a social worker, if I'm honest. And I remember when I was sort of a teenager speaking to my mum's friend who was a social worker. She was like, oh no, you're too young, don't do it, it's a terrible job, you know. And it's just like, and you're far too young to decide now, and really, you know, wait until you're, you know, 45 before you decide. I mean, she was really trying to put me off. And so I did, and I went sort of, you know, I did a degree in physiology, which is nothing to do with anything that I'm doing now. And sort of, but just, and then sort of graduated as a physiologist, knowing that whatever it is I wanted to do in life, it wasn't physiology or anything lab based. And then sort of decided on, got a job in a bookshop just so I could pay my bills. Got really bored really quick, and worked for this charity, volunteered for this charity called Prisoners, Families and Friends. And it was through that I learned about the role probation officer. And everybody there wanted to be a probation officer, and at the time, in order to be a probation officer, you had to be a social worker. And sort of it kind, I don't know, it's just like it feels a bit like the path fell in front of me, and I just kind of followed it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, absolutely. And it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because you get a lot of reflected stigma for that population. It's heavily stigmatized. But I think as well, sometimes the people who work with them and for them also experience that on a sort of secondary basis. So I was just curious there for a little bit.
Yeah. So my partner at the time was a social worker, and I'd go around telling everybody, he'd do anything to avoid telling people he was a social worker, and I described myself as a social worker because it was much better than being known as a probation officer. Much safer, you know. So I mean, there's, you know, and you know, you work
grades of it. I get that.
Yeah, absolutely.
It works. So then when you came to do sort of like come back again to look at sort of academic working and do your PhD, you've described how you came to sort of light on this subject of, you know, technology and coercive control and domestic abuse. So how then did you move forward? How did you go about deciding this is the research you want to do, how you were going to collect your data, and then we'll talk a little bit about your findings, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I think I decided that I realized pretty quickly that I really wanted to do the mobile phone. And so I was looking specifically at mobile phones rather than technology per se, and smartphones and how would they, because they just had to, there was just no way they weren't going to change it. But at the time, there was literally nothing written about it. So I kind of had a bit of a blank page, which can be scary, but also very helpful, I think, when you're doing a PhD, because it doesn't matter what road you go down, it's going to be the first time anybody's done it. So there's original ideas right behind. So I took a lot of comfort for that. And it just, and I think, because through my work in South Bank University tutoring students, I was going out to a lot of placements, and many of those placements were women's refugees. And so I kind of inadvertently built up relationships with managers of refugees and key workers in refugees. And so that had already existed. But what's really important to me, and has always been really important to me actually, is giving people a voice. So typically for me it would be women and girls, but anybody who doesn't really get a voice that needs to speak, I felt that my PhD invited that opportunity to give these women who are so seldom heard a voice. And so there's quite a lot of bureaucracy involved and a fair bit of persuading here, there and everywhere. But actually I got into the refugees. So it was Hestia who let me in, and I got into the refugees and then started interviewing the women. And then I think because of my practice experience, I was able to build, you know, so one of the things I remember being asked was like, well, you know, how do you know that, you know, a perpetrator isn't putting her up to this? And I'd be like, because I think I'll know from the language that's used. And that really resonated with the person who had the ultimate decision. And so I think because I worked with perpetrators and I kind of got their mindset and understood their tactics, I think that enabled me to build a trusting relationship with the women pretty quickly. And also I think having sat both sides of the fence, if you like, in a professional capacity, I think that adds to my research for sure, because I can sort of see things from both angles, and especially when it comes to risk assessment.
See, this is why it's so important that practitioners undertake research. So important, or at least you have practitioners involved in the planning and the organization and data collection, because you know the language and even the kind of gut instinct, all that stuff that you need to have in order to get really good data and actually to ask the right questions in the first place. I think you've got,
and how to ask them, actually.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's really important in research, but it's also really important in social work and probation.
Yeah. And I think as well, practitioners of all kinds produce a slightly different type of research that has a different feel to it. There's always a real consideration for the interviewees, for the people providing data, that you don't always see in research that's pure psychology based. Which is a thing that troubles me sometimes, but I think it's really interesting to have that, the kind of the research head, the creativity and the practice all coming together, and also your own moral and ethics that really underpin and inform what you do. So if anyone out there is thinking, you know, about doing that kind of further study and thinks, oh, I'm a practitioner, don't look at it as an absolute benefit and an asset. Don't think of it as something that's going to hold you back.
No, because it's much more impactful, I think. You know, if you've worked with people, then the research that you're going to do is likely to impact them on them in some real way.
Yeah.
And so from where I am in my career now, my research has to be impactful.
Yeah.
But that's fine by me, because I don't do research so that I can call myself a doctor. I do research so that I can make a difference to people's lives. So both of those things sit very comfortably.
Yeah, it takes us on very much to the findings that you had. So when you did this really new piece of work, no one else had done it, you were right that something bad was going to happen. Tell us a little bit about what you found.
So I think one of there were quite a lot of things I found. So the first thing I found was that perpetrators, perpetrators employ tactics, and have done, you know, for since the beginning of time, have developed these tactics that they use. And there's a very well-established, very well-respected model called the power and control wheel, which was based on research done in the late 1980s. And so there's 8 tactics that this model suggests are used by perpetrators. And what became really apparent within about 3 or 4 interviews was that actually all the examples they give of how their phones were being used fitted into this model. And so one of my conclusions for my PhD was actually the tactics are the same. It's just that it's not just, but it's that technology is being absorbed into these tactics, and that the tactics are being upgraded, if you like, because of this technology. And so, you know, the reasons behind it, the purpose of it, the reason they do the things that they do, that hasn't really changed. It's just they're using different things. So that was the first thing. And so the motivation hasn't changed and stuff. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing was to look at, the other thing I realized was that because we always carry our mobile phones with us, because, you know, you never have your mobile phone. I mean, I speak for myself, but I'm sure I'm not the only one who leaves home without a mobile phone and then goes home. Yes, and mine too, right? But, you know, if I leave the house and I've got my mobile phone, I'd rather be late than be on time and not have my mobile phone, right? So we've all got it all the time. And so what this affords is a 24/7 surveillance. So there's no getting away from it. So once upon a time, you know, perpetrators of domestic abuse would lock their partners up in a coal shed, literally I'm Welsh, okay? So but would literally lock their partners up in the coal shed while they went to work. And then when they came back from work, would unlock the coal shed, and then they'd have to go and sort of do all the housework and whatever the perpetrator demanded. But actually, with your mobile phone, you don't need to be locked up. There's no need for that, because you've got your mobile phone the whole time. And so you're contactable all the time. And to the extent that, and the thing is that if you're not contactable, then that in itself is a reason for being abused. if the perpetrator can't contact their partner, then what is that partner hiding? That's the mentality of the perpetrator. And so what I found, although this wasn't part of my research, but women, for example, wouldn't go in the tube. Because they'd lose the signal, and that would result in a particularly fierce beating when they got home. And so women would take 5 or 6 buses to go from A to B rather than a 20-minute journey on a tube. And that would be a way of managing their risk. And so this connection to, and like not picking up was a dangerous thing. Or missing a call was a dangerous thing. And so what happens is that you've got you're on tender hooks the whole time. You're just walking, you're waiting the entire time, and that's anxiety provoking, okay, and that's exhausting. And then you go to bed and you think, this is my safe place, and then the text will ring, or the text will go, the phone will ring. So there's never any break from it. And that, I think, is the first time that's ever really happened.
Yeah, very much so. So one of the things you're finding then is this piece of technology has not changed the type of abuse, it's changed the way abuse happens. So now people have a way of pinpointing somebody. So presumably we have things like GPS and tracking and stuff like that we need to think about. Also, it's absolutely physically changing people's behavior. So things like you can only imagine the anxiety, because everyone who's worked with GPS knows that it's not that accurate. The idea of it placing you somewhere where you're not, or misidentifying where you are, that would be really scary, I assume, as well.
Yeah, and that happened to one of the women that I interviewed. Susie, that's not her real name. And so she'd been a landlady. She had a really successful career until she met her abusive partner. And she'd been a landlady, and part of the conditions that she would impose on her was that she was never allowed to go into a pub. Okay. And so she'd go for a walk sometimes, not very often, but she'd go for a walk, and then say she'd walk down the street. There's a pub in many streets in London, but the GPS tracker might put her in the building, not outside. And so then that would be a trigger then, or a reason for the abuse. And then in the end, you just stop going out, literally stop going out. Because she couldn't manage what the tracker was doing, she had no control over that.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you look at the kind of sort of strength and determination of people to try to keep going, even though their circle is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and their feeling of what they can do is getting smaller, but people still sort of struggle on. It's frightening, but it's also kind of inspiring as well, and that people will keep trying to sort of be free and to exercise their freedom as much as they can. So the other thing I assume would be an issue as well, not just the constant sort of being watched and called, and the fear of missing a call, because sometimes you don't have signal coverage and things like that, but also presumably people can listen as well on your...
Yeah, that didn't come out so much. So one of the things that came out, so one of the women that he had her Facebook page on his phone, and so he'd be notified of any communication before she would, and then he would often pretend to be her. And if it was a text from a man, it didn't matter if the man was a brother or a cousin or a nephew, then he would respond. He would be really rude. So that they wouldn't respond again. But she would find this out later on, because the pings would go to his phone, not hers.
I mean, it's really scary, isn't it? And you think, oh, how does this happen? But we've just been watching, well, I don't watch it, I have to say, I'm too old for Love Island. But if you look at what's playing out now on Love Island, this idea of being accused of stuff you haven't done, of being really emotionally controlled and gaslighted is so common. Sometimes people don't even seem to understand that they're doing it. It's really... how this behavior escalates is something I think people can struggle to understand. Yeah,
and I think there's a big difference, I think, between sort of coercive control, because for me that's deliberate. Okay,
Yeah.
and there's a deliberate, and so for me it has to be deliberate, it has to be credible, and the perpetrator has to be afraid of the consequences, and the victim survivor has to be afraid of the consequences. So those three things, I think, is what in my view constitutes coercive control. Because if it's not deliberate, like if you've got mental health issue, if you're withdrawing from drugs, if you've got dementia, then I think that's not a deliberate coercive control in the way that I've been researching it. And then we have that very fine line when people might know on social media with the Love Island things, and they, they must know that what they're saying isn't very nice.
Oh yeah, for sure.
You know, but then I guess it's like, is the intention to cause fear?
I think the intention, to me, seemed to be to make the person not do it again. So for me, that's absolute control, isn't it? To make it so difficult and unpleasant for them that they don't do that behaviour that you find objectionable again. So for me, that is control, isn't it? If you create,
I mean, it's bullying, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's lots of grey bits to it. You know what I mean? And
but it's very pervasive in our society. That's what I find really strange.
Absolutely, and you can see, so I do some work with girls and young women in gangs, and social media is used very, very often to recruit them, and there's that whole sort of lover boy thing where they build these trust, and it's really subtle and really slow, but these are kids, and they trust people, and before they know it, they've divulged so much about their lives without even realizing it, so there's this manipulation. This social media allows manipulation without that even having to identify themselves.
It's a real access point, isn't it? That and I think one of the reasons it's so important to have these kinds of conversations is for when professionals are having risk interviews with people, when they are reviewing cases, when people are talking about distress. It's really important that staff particularly understand what's possible and what isn't with technology, because we have had situations where people have misunderstood the risk to someone because they haven't understood what this behavior is, or even what the possibilities are for it. So I think it's really important for people to have these kind of open discussions. I think we've got some questions coming in, Dave. Can I come over to you?
Yeah, absolutely. We've had a question in from Roy, and it actually fits in with something that I wanted to raise. Roy's question is, does that also include wrist-worn devices? So obviously we're talking about mobile phones before, but I think Apple have done quite a lot of work about their AirTag devices that have kind of been used by people that are stalking. So I don't know if you can sort of give any comments about that, Tirion.
I can't comment specifically about smart watches, but there's smart technology for sure. So we see, it would be right. I mean, if you can be tracked, and if you can be tracked, and you can be texted, and you can be called, and you can be, controlled through a watch, which of course you can nowadays, then that's definitely a vehicle to use for coercive control. And we see things like smart meters, and these hub things. Is that what they're called? The heating places and the smart fridges, and all and all of these are often, and you can control the lighting, you can turn the music on and off. All of these are we've gone sort of beyond the mobile phone now, and we've gone into sort of the smart homes. Okay, and that would include smart watches, absolutely. But I think largely at the moment anyway, mobile phones is how they're all controlled. And so and so there's been a few cases of people who and there's a film called Gaslight, which has got Ingrid Bergman, and it's from the 1930s. I know you like your films, Nicky, but I mean, it's an amazing film. If you haven't watched it, you should watch it. It hasn't aged at all. I watched it a few months ago. Hasn't aged at all. But so what this is, sort of that film's almost been upgraded with technology. And so what you do is what's very common is perpetrators, when they're not in the house, will turn the heat up. And then the woman survivor would be boiling hot, and then turn the heat down, and then the woman survivor is freezing cold. And then when the perpetrator comes back, it's like, no, that was all in your head. And there's that gaslighting, or turns the fridge off, or the food goes off, and then either they did a really bad shop, or why have they waited so, and the gaslighting thing would be, well, why have you waited so long before cooking it? You bought that 2 weeks ago, and in fact it was probably 3 days ago. So, you know, it creates this stage for abuse. So I don't think there's any technology, to be honest, that isn't used.
And the idea of switching music on in the middle of the night as well.
Yes, yeah, really, and, you know, and that's part of the sleep deprivation as well.
And makes neighbours furious, and then distances you again.
Yeah. So, and there's loads of stuff around isolation, you know, and that's the massive part about all forms of domestic abuse, is this isolation. So you haven't got anybody to talk to, and there's nobody there to tell you that's not normal, or that's not a healthy relationship, you know. And yeah, and certainly one of the women I interviewed, he used to bombard her with, she'd go out hardly ever, but she'd go out with her friends, and then he'd bombard her with texts, like 30, 40 texts in an hour. I mean, as quick as you can write it, that's when he was sending it. Then he'd follow that up with phone calls. Then he'd follow that up with video calls, and he'd want to see videos of the people that she was with, and she was where she said she was and who she said she was with. And then a few times she turned the phone off because she just couldn't cope with it anymore. It was just too much. And so he started phoning her friends. So the people she was with, he was bombarding them with texts, and just went through them. And of course, you know, she didn't want to go out anymore because it was embarrassing for her. But you could also see that they might not want to invite her. You know, and so she's isolated.
So Tirion, in terms of this, and obviously, you know, the domestic abuse charities will be doing lots to support women, but is the kind of, you know, really good guidance out there in terms of how you identify these kind of controlling behaviours early on, and people can kind of use it as a bit of a trigger warning to think, no, actually, you know, this isn't normal, this is something that I do need to be sort of anxious about, and I need to think about whether this is a relationship that I need to kind of curtail?
So there's Refuge have done some research into technology and how that's used. There's a briefing paper in the House of Commons library, and then of course there's my paper.
We're tweeting out.
But I think it's about. Well, if you're struggling to see your friends on your own, and you want to see them, but you don't feel able to, that is probably a very good indicator that things aren't quite as they should be, and that this isn't an expression. If you want to go out and you don't feel able to, then that is not an expression of love. That is an expression of control. And if that is happening, then start to look at other things.
Yeah, definitely.
As a very basic rule. But isolation is, to not be isolated when you're experiencing abuse is, to my knowledge, unprecedented. And I also include, you can see your friends, but only if he's with you. And I'm using these just as I'm using these genders, she's the victim, he's the perpetrator, because that's my research. I mean, you know, it could be same-sex relationship and happen the other way around, okay? So it's just like, if your partner, whatever their gender, isn't willing for you to go and see your friends on your own when you want to, I would take that as a trigger. Yeah,
definitely. Refuge have actually got a tech team, which is really useful to know. We've just retweeted out, and they've got some stats saying 26% of women whose partner or ex-partner knows their password don't know how to secure their devices, and they've got a digital breakup tool that's been created with Avast that helps people to understand any potential vulnerabilities, and just in the same way you might change your lock on your door, how you would be able to change your devices and how you'd be able to maintain your safety.
And also another sort of top tip is with your Wi-Fi, so if you're having people back to your house and stuff, don't use the Wi-Fi that's been allocated, and don't keep your stickers with the password somewhere where people can see. So change it and then use a password, and don't share that with anybody in your house unless you know them. And then, you know, yeah. So that's another thing. So if you're having a one-night stand or something, just make sure that there's no way that person can get access to your Wi-Fi.
Yeah, and it's weird because I don't think we've ever had to really think about those sorts of things before, but it's really key.
Yeah.
I've got a question from I think it's a student saying this this all sounds awful, so I'm sorry about that, guys. How does it happen that somebody hands their phone over to somebody?
Well, sometimes
it's something that a lot of people ask questions like this, and how, because when we're talking about these really sort of intense examples, it feels like it's hard for people to understand how you go from liking someone to being terrified of them.
Okay, so I think my first question would be, does your partner use your mobile phone? Has your partner ever said, oh God, I can't find my phone, or yours? Or maybe you've got more data than your partner. And actually, if you're in love with this person and you trust them and you think you're going to be with them forever, why wouldn't you? So the question isn't really, I don't think, why would you? The question is, why wouldn't you? Because you've got this trusting, loving relationship. But also, of course, you know, many of the women I interviewed were assaulted to have access to their mobile phone. Yeah. One of the women would have her hand twisted behind her back, and then he'd take her thumb and use her thumbprint to open the phone. She didn't give consent. That's how it was done. But usually what happens, was very typical with domestic abuse, is that you build up this loving relationship. And again, we see that with girls and young women in gangs. There's this like, I love you, I want to be with you. And this form of abuse is really specific. Yeah. And which is why domestic abuse is different. And one of the reasons why domestic abuse is so different from stranger violence is because you've got this trust. And then all this trust, your vulnerabilities, all your dreams, everything that you share with your partner, because that's what you do when you're in a relationship. Okay, that's what we all do in our relationships. Okay, but there comes a point where that information is used against you. So your insecurities is used as evidence. Okay, the threats that are made against you, the name calling is about all your insecurities. The threats that are made against you are in relation to what you're most worried about. Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting when you kind of describe some of the changes that are happening and have happened, and just that bit about, you know, if it used to be that you could access your phone by a code, then maybe that's easier to sort of protect, where now you can do it by your thumb. Well, if you're asleep, could someone sort of use your thumb to access the phone? You know, could they sort of waft it in front of your face to access it, you know, from using your face to open it? And that bit about, there's so many bits of information on our phones that are accessed with those things. So, you know, I think about how many banking apps I've got on my phone that are accessed by those, you know, those ways of accessing it. And actually someone that I, you know, lived with could completely take over my life really, really quickly. Whereas maybe, you know, a few years ago, that would have been a little bit harder, you know, a little bit more complicated. If, say, you had to go into the branch with someone, you know, of a bank, then it's kind of a bit different. But when you really kind of start to think about how life has been made more convenient for us, you know, actually it's quite scary, isn't it, about how it's also been made much more convenient for people that would want to abuse us.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of, and also, so, you know, because this technological abuse can be covert or overt. Okay. And so one of the things that, you know, if you suspect that you're in an abusive relationship, or you're worried about someone who might be in an abusive relationship, or if you're working with someone, then do check the phone to make sure that there aren't any apps downloaded that you didn't download. Because it may be that when you weren't looking, an app was downloaded that is checking your phone and feeding back information. So if there's an app there that you don't know anything about, and there's all the other stuff going on as well, then that might be a perpetrator trying to control you. You know.
We've been talking about the kind of physical risks and the sort of physical changes and the way that behaviour can be altered by this constant sort of watching and fear. And one of the things that I think would be really interesting for us to just get our heads around as well is this idea about the Panopticon Effect, about what it is, what it means, and why it's important that people working in health, social care and education understand what it means?
Yeah, no, so this, for me, this is crucial, okay? So the Panopticon is a term that was devised by Jeremy Bentham back in the, I think, 17th century, but I'll stand corrected. Anyway, it was a long time ago, and 18th century, I think it was. And basically, most of, if not all of the Victorian prisons in England and presumably Wales were built according to this concept, right? So Brixton Prison is an example, Pentonville Prison is an example. And what Bentham said was, he built this prison within a Panopticon effect. And the idea was that the prison, in the middle of a prison, there's a guard tower, and there's a guard inside this tower. And then the guard in the tower can see every single prisoner. And back in those days, there was one prisoner to a cell, okay? And so the guard in the guard tower can see every single prisoner because he's got a round view of everybody, but the prisoner can't see anybody else and can only see the guard tower. Okay, and so that was the design of the prisons. And then the theory that came out of it was that because the prisoners could only see the tower and not the guards, they were never sure when they were being watched. And so they started, and so they behaved as if they were always being watched. Okay, and the idea was that eventually they wouldn't need any locks or bars or violence to manage these people because they would manage themselves. So they would self-regulation is how Foucault went on to describe it, and he goes into a lot of detail about the self-regulation. Okay, and so that was the idea of the Panopticon. And so as part of my research, I proposed that actually what happens with mobile phones is because we've got them with us 24/7, that the mobile phone serves as the tower. The guard, the perpetrator serves as the guard. So you've always got your phone, you can see the guard, but you never know when the perpetrator is going to contact you. Okay, but because we've got our phone with us all the time, there's no walls in this prison, because you can go shopping, you can go clubbing, you can go wherever you want to go, because that perpetrator can potentially contact you at any point. And so what happens, even though he's not with you, you're not going to go places or see people just in case he's watching. And what came out in my research was that actually it was completely impossible sometimes for the perpetrator to know where they were, right? But they still believed that they could. So they left their phone at home. They still thought the perpetrator would find them. Yeah. These sorts of things. And so what happens is with the women that I interviewed, what happened was that they didn't go places they knew the perpetrator wouldn't approve of. Whether they were there or not. And so their behavior really changes, and they keep looking over their shoulder, right? So what the mobile phone does, in my view, is it gives this sense of omnipotence and omnipresence. So the perpetrator is everywhere but nowhere, everywhere but can't be seen. So you're always going to behave as if he's going to find you. You always behave as if he's just around the corner. And so imagine if you're on holidays in Australia, right, and you go into a club and somebody takes a photo of you and your mate and sticks it on social media, and then 10 minutes later you get a text from your abusive partner saying, "I don't like you in that blue dress, take it off." You have no idea if the perpetrator is in the club with you or if he's seen the post on social media, but what you probably do is go home. Yeah, and so there's this panoptic effect that causes this self-surveillance. And so the women I spoke to would talk about how they were paranoid. Okay, and how, you must think I'm mad. And for me, I think that's very normal behavior, a very, very normal reaction to abnormal behavior. But actually, I can also see how these women might present to GP surgeries, to hospitals, to police, to courts, to whoever, to social workers, and they might look like they've got mental health problems.
Definitely. There's a lot of different things going on there, and we just need to quickly unpack some of them. So the idea is that because reformers back in the day wanted people to have like a moral sense themselves, there's this idea that, if God is watching you, you'll behave. And I can understand where this idea started, but like many ideas, it starts in one place and ends up in a completely different place. So
Yeah.
this idea that people will morally behave because they're perpetually worried about being seen doing something wrong, it's an idea that starts in one place, but like all power, it depends how it's being used, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And so if you've got a situation where with the phone where somebody is able to see where you are, see what you're doing, see who you're with, see who you're talking to, all of a sudden you've got a fear that's not about walls, isn't it? Because you were saying, being locked in a coal shed back at the start, that's how people were controlled physically. And in the prison, they're controlled physically by being locked in a cell. But this is a prison which is so, for me, I find it really frightening because you import the walls into your own head.
Yeah.
So even when you're walking around, you're still afraid. Even when you think you can go somewhere, you're actually not going there. All those route changes that we see and all those people sitting on 5 buses, that's such an intense form of control, isn't it?
Yes.
And so powerful. And I can imagine, if a professional doesn't understand what they're seeing, I can understand people being described as paranoid and people be seen as unreliable witnesses to their own bodies and their own experiences. Particularly if you're then saying things like, the music comes on and off at night, I can hear a voice and then I can't hear it anymore. Or, I get these hot flashes, they come up and down. You can imagine, can't you? Yeah. Every single stereotype about people being unreliable, shoot into a professional's mind, and not for any like dark purposes, just because it's such an odd presentation.
And another dynamic that fits into that is that a survivor's fear is based on what might happen.
Yeah.
Okay. And so in refuges, it's very common to, when somebody joins a refuge, a very common sort of initial assessment is when's the first time the abuse happened, when's the last time the abuse happened, and when's the worst time the abuse happened. And so what you've got to think of is whatever the worst thing is. So if the worst thing was non-fatal strangulation, that survivor knows that's a go-to. So what would they be afraid of now?
Yeah, the next thing up, being killed.
So what's the next thing up? Yeah. And so what feeds into all of this gaslighting and this self-surveillance is this constant fear of what's he going to do next. And the whole thing about, there are there are many, many murders and homicides with domestic abuse, but actually the whole point of the control is not to kill them. So you never, for example, send a perpetrator of domestic abuse on an anger management program.
Yeah. Because
you're essentially teaching them tactics.
It happens all the time, though, doesn't it?
It does. But really, that's not good practice. And if anybody out there has done it, don't do it anymore.
I think what's really interesting about this is how much, that people are sort of dimly aware they should know more about this, but for some reason, considering it's so prevalent, people are very bad at seeing it.
So Stark talks about how it's invisible in plain sight and that you have to have the wider context to completely understand it. And there was and he's got this fabulous example in his book, which if anybody's interested, I definitely recommend it. But it's so what he said, there was this woman in America and she was in a baseball team, and she'd go every week. She wouldn't miss a week. She'd hardly ever miss a week, and she'd go. And then at the end of it, her husband would always offer to go to the pub, and he'd always buy the rounds, and they'd always be charming. And sometimes when it was cold, he'd even bring her a hoodie and give her a hoodie. And he was just this lovely, gorgeous, amazing boyfriend. And of course, he was always going there because he wanted to keep tabs on her. He was always going to the pub with her because he didn't want her going to the pub on her own. And giving her the hoodie was symbolic of, you've crossed a line and I'm going to beat you later on and you're going to need this to cover your bruises.
Frightening, isn't it? Really frightening.
But if you look outside, if you think, well, she never comes on her own. He always says when it's time to go home.
Yeah.
Then you have to kind of piece them together.
Yeah.
And that's not always easy.
I think you have to have your eyes open, don't you? And I think it's very easy to shut them because it is disturbing to think about.
Yeah, one of the watchers said, it's really horrible, you know.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. So if anybody is watching this and is sort of experiencing or recognizing patterns, we are tweeting out resources, we're tweeting out things that if you want to just learn more about this will be really helpful. So some of the ideas, the concepts, so thinking about the wheel, thinking about Panopticon, all those things that might help you to have more confidence in your practice. We're tweeting that out as we go under the hashtag MHTV. So do have a look at that. And if you're not sure, find a professional or find a colleague or find someone to talk to about this so that you are in a place where you're learning. Because I think sometimes when you don't know something, it feels almost too stressful to find out more about it or too stressful to ask. But if you want to have confidence in this area and if you want to be able to support people, it's really important that you've got your head around these sorts of issues and the things that you're likely to come up against.
And what I would say is that if you work in health and social care, there's no way you haven't come across domestic abuse. There's just no way. It's too prevalent.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to have to finish up soon because we've whizzed by again, as ever. So I guess we'll just come to everybody for like anything, any of the last thoughts they've got, any resources they want to share, any last ideas. So Dave, I'll come to you first and then we'll come to Tirion.
Yeah, so I suppose it's the thing that we'd always say on an episode like tonight, isn't it, Nicky, that, you know, if people that are watching are experiencing domestic abuse themselves, then absolutely don't think that you're alone. And I'll tweet out the contact details for VAWG for the 24-hour National Domestic Abuse Helpline, because there are people that are available 24/7 that want to help. So don't feel that you're on your own in terms of that. But, you know, it's been fascinating listening to Tirion tonight, especially, you know, my sort of experience and history as a health visitor working in a women's refuge at times, that, you know, it's always sort of really important to sort of, you know, learn what perpetrators are doing next, so you can actually kind of, you know, speak to, you know, for me it was speak to mums and encourage them to sort of look for those signals that they should be concerned about. So it's been, you know, really informative tonight. So thanks for that, Tirion.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. And just to say, if there is anybody, I mean, I really hope I haven't upset anybody. It's a really difficult subject, and there's no way to get round that, really. But, you know, if you're feeling overwhelmed and you want to do something and you don't know what to do, then if all else, you know, if there's nothing, whatever you do, just be kind, be kind. And if you're surviving abuse or going through an abusive relationship now, people will believe you. We will believe you. Okay, and if somebody tells you that they're being abused, believe them and be kind, and that takes you a long way in life, I think.
I don't think we've found a better way of finishing up our 99th episode than that. Tirion, we've been absolutely delighted to have you with us. Before we go, obviously we're having our summer break now, so we want you to run and be free. Enjoy these days. Don't forget as well, if you are having like missing us, there is a load of back episodes that you can watch and relive those moments. But we're going to be back on the 15th of September with an episode on heavy metal therapy. So we're going to be again tackling new ground. So thank you so much for spending time with us today. I hope you found this as interesting and helpful as I have. And we wish you all the best, and we'll see you after the summer. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.